Now I know Dune Awakening is not an extraction shooter, but with extraction shooter content being drier than Arrakis and innovative features being rare, I took a look at it. And the settings, features, and implications give me this odd feeling. A growing feeling that seems to want to burst out of me. Could this feeling be hope? Or the Taco Bell I ate earlier?
That's not hope!
Okay, if you haven't been keeping up with the development of Dune Awakening, I will quickly break down the basics just to catch you up, but I want to explore some of its features as I think games in the future could benefit greatly from them. Now I know it's not an extraction shooter, but many of the systems in it can easily be transferable, and are appealing to players that do enjoy the genre, or others for that matter. And even if you're not particularly interested in this game, it could be valuable to at least be informed on different ways to approach similar problems. The key features I want to drill down into are a modular rotating map, a symbiotic relationship between PVE and PVP communities, and combined arms with scarcity. But before we get started, if you enjoy gameplay discussions, extraction shooters, and want to stay up to date with the latest news in the genre, hit that subscribe button, and check out the Discord link down below. With that out of the way, let's get to it. Okay, so here's a super simple high altitude breakdown of Dune Awakening, and bear in mind this is purely based on the information that's been revealed and marketed, as the release date is set for May 20th. So some of these features and how they play out as intended may be super solid and exactly as advertised, or just dust in the wind. It's an MMO with some basic survival elements, like hydration, sunstroke risk, some level of loot loss, as well as base building. There are pockets of POIs and opportunities for PvP in designated zones throughout the leveling process, but the big focus seems to be in the quote-unquote end game. This is centered around a very large portion of the map referred to as the Deep Desert. It has PvE POIs, but it is an open PvP zone, and said portion of the map resets every week. The reset takes the form of a giant sandstorm that doesn't just reset everything that's in the Deep Desert, presumably killing players that are still there when it happens, and destroying bases that are built within it. But it also changes the map itself. Each player must then rescout the map via going there for themselves or using scanners or specialized tools for mapping large sections of it. And this brings me to the first feature I want to explore for their application for other types of games, namely extraction shooters or any other open world style shooter out there. The setting of Arrakis makes things a little easier in terms of feasibility and visuals. After all, you need a metaphorical and literal sandbox as a blank canvas, then moving things around, remove some, add some, and then boom. You've created a level of replayability with significantly less work than trying to create a dozen or so maps. But that doesn't mean you can only do it in a desert and only when you can find ways to destroy and rebuild the environment over and over again. You can create a template to follow. First, you need a foundation with clear sections as a blank canvas with a cohesive environmental biome. Next, you need sections with the express purpose of being able to be placed down on their own. Basically, fully built POIs that don't require any outside terrain in order to function cohesively within said biome. Then you need a justification for changing it on a regular basis. And that's not even that difficult to come up with. Let me give a very basic, super simple example of what I'm talking about. Depending on the desired size of the map, you can start off with a basic 3x3 grid. Without placing anything on it, these portions of the map will be relatively flat. Obviously, they aren't going to be completely empty. They could be filled with a type of filler canvas, just a preset combination of small terrain features, something that fits the biome, but ultimately they're just there to help reduce the density between POIs. If it's a wooded area, you can have a combination of brush and trees. If it's a desert area, you can have a few rock outcroppings. And if it's an urban area, you can have rubble and wreckage. You get the point. Okay, next you take independent POIs and place them into any of these slots. You then plug them in however you see fit. Here's an example. Okay, so just using 6 POI examples, I can easily rotate and move them to create different maps. Now you don't even have to have this in rigid placement scripts either. You can build POIs built to link to one another or be on their own. You can create a less or more dense experience based on their distance from one another. And this is just a super basic example, and I'm sure you can already see the potential. If you needed a reason for this constant change, most storylines can manage that. For example, in the Cycle Frontiers case, you can justify the change easily by saying the factions change focus on different portions of the planet based on storm conditions. Imagine having a map that rotates on a weekly basis, rarely being the same. If a portion of the map ends up being less enjoyable for whatever reason, it's going to rotate in a week anyways. There will always be new lines of sight to consider, new paths to take or avoid, new mission locations, etc. Now, certain things need to be considered. Firstly, the new player experience is a big one. Ideally, this kind of system would be utilized best for the more mid-level or higher level population of your player base. The other thing to consider is certain terrain features would be way more difficult to account for, rivers and waterfalls for example. While not impossible to work around, I would imagine not the easiest either. And you don't even have to build an entire game experience around this feature either. Just giving players a reason to engage with it on a regular basis is enough. Okay, so I'll let all those possibilities simmer on your brain for a little bit. Next, I'll move on to something else I find interesting about Dune Awakening. So it appears that a lot of the endgame materials are found in the deep desert, which is the PvP zone, and there will also be PVE POIs for you to grind for said materials. After mulling it over, I think there are a couple of opportunities and a couple of issues that may come up. And I can't say this enough, this is based purely on what information has been put out, so huge grains of salt. For starters, it seems the only earnest PvP to engage in is delegated to the quote-unquote end game, and that the only real way to acquire end-game materials is to venture into said PvP zones or trade with them at player hubs. I feel like that's a system that is trying to please everyone and might end up pleasing no one. PvP players will have to slog through whatever PvE content they have to in order to get to the part of the game that actually attracts them the most. What is required in order to get there is unknown. It could be a hard lock like a leveling requirement or story progression, or it could be a soft lock like needing a reasonable level of materials in order to compete reasonably. It's constantly referred to as the quote-unquote end game, so if the bar is set too high and the grind too long, it could be annoying just to get to that part of the game you want to play. On the flip side, the PvE players I think have it worse. They get to participate in the game fully from the start to be sure, but it seems a lot of effort has been put into the end game in order to try to make it replayable. So it's reasonable to assume much of the development of the game is going to go forward focusing on this portion of the game. As of right now, how much of the game you get to play before you have to really start thinking about PvP as a necessity is unknown. It's been said that a lot of the end game materials can only be found in the deep desert. So does that mean a lot of the end game quests take place outside or exclusively in it? Either way, in my opinion, it seems like a frustrating situation waiting to happen. Sure, you can in theory trade with people who have gone into the deep desert. However, I can foresee a certain level of gouging that can happen if not carefully monitored. But if you're one of those people who enjoy both, I can see this being a good setup for you. While I personally do prefer a PvP experience, I can easily see taking a more relaxed night to grind PvE POIs with the added upside of supplying future PvP runs. Guilds are limited to 30-ish players, and I can already see a huge benefit in cooperation between PvP-oriented guilds and PvE ones. PvE players can grind materials and supply PvP players with a cut in exchange for escort or defensive services. It's not all negative, and I can definitely see some unique possibilities. Now the map is also said to be extremely large with specific server technology to help diffuse a lot of the population. It is feasible that a PvE player venturing out won't be squeezed out too much, but I imagine it won't take many instances of being ganked while trying to avoid PvP to heavily frustrate people who are just trying to PvE. On the flip side, if the map is that big, then that just means PvP players will be starved for what they want. I can easily see a situation where it will be just enough PvP to frustrate PvE players, but not enough to satisfy PvP players. Again, depending on how they manage it, you might end up with a situation where neither group is happy. I'll comment more on this specifically once I get my hands on it, because it feels like there are some opportunities that can really attract both groups. And finally, Dune Awakening has a robust system for creating vehicles. Multiple chassis and variants exist for both land and air with multiple pods and how you can customize them. Based on info, these systems will eat up a good amount of resources, so they represent their own level of risk. Sure, you can rocket barrage from the air, but all of the rockets need crafting. Combine this with base building and guilds, I think you have a lot of room to create depth and replayability while also encouraging player communities to keep each other passionate about the game. I've already gone into great detail on how these systems will solve extraction shooter genre's main issues in my last video, linked above. Regardless of whether or not Dune Awakening is in this genre or that, I can always appreciate developers pushing the possibilities that games that can create instead of pumping out a safe reclone year after year after year. But what do you think? Does Dune Awakening pique your interest or not? Leave your answer and why down in the comments. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and good hunting.